So my name is Eli Friedman. I'm running the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative lecture series this semester. The focus has been on migration in China. And I'm extremely pleased to be able to welcome Gerald Roche as the third speaker in our series. Before I do the introduction, I just want to mention the next speaker who's going to be coming on May 10th, I believe. Professor Biao Xiang is presenting on international reproduction migration, the case of China. And that's going to be the final speaker in the series. I can put the link in the chat in just a minute, but really encourage you to sign up for that as well. Okay, so yes, we're really pleased to welcome Gerald Roche virtually to visit us here at Cornell today. Gerald is a senior research fellow at La Trobe University, which is in Australia, which is in a very different time zone than Ithaca, New York. So we're particularly glad that Gerald has woken up very early in the morning and to share his research with us. You can actually see out his window, it is still dark there. So he's doing extra work. Gerald's done some really wonderful work on language politics in Tibet, looking at minority languages, and he has a fantastic forthcoming article that I just taught less than an hour ago in class on urbanization in Tibet, and I really recommend checking that out. So today, what we're going to hear about the idea of settler-colonialism and what it might mean in the Tibetan context, a phrase that you may be familiar with respect to North America. And so what does it mean to think about it in the context of Tibet in China? So I'll leave it at that and turn it over to Gerald.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Eli. I'm just going to get my PowerPoint started here. Okay. So I just want to begin by acknowledging where I am and where I'm speaking from. So I'm talking to you today from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. This is the city of Melbourne. It's also the traditional lands of the Boonwurrung people, who were also part of the broader Kulin Nation. Melbourne was founded as a settler city in 1835, 1836, so it has a relatively short history compared to the indigenous history of the area, which stretches back tens of thousands of years. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about Melbourne, its history of settler colonialism and its indigenous people as a way to exemplify some of the points that I'm going to make about settler colonialism and urbanization. So as Eli mentioned, it's early morning here. You can see the darkness out the window. This is west facing. To the east, the sun is rising up over the mountains, but it's still dark out here. But if we could see out the window, what we would see is there's a park beside our apartment here. It's early morning. There's people out walking the dog, maybe pushing a stroll around, jogging and so on. Very nice, peaceful, pleasant scene. And I'm saying this because I want to preface the idea of that very nice, peaceful, pleasant scene is colonialism in its present form, right? That we have a situation here in Melbourne, in New York, in Ithaca, of ongoing colonialism, of ongoing colonial domination. And what does it look like? It looks like people walking the dog at 6:30 in the pre-dawn dark, right? That's what ongoing colonialism looks like in countries like Australia and the USA. Colonialism doesn't always wear a pith helmet, it doesn't always carry a whip and so on. We need to be alert to and conscious of the different forms that colonialism takes and the way that it is veiled and concealed in the everyday realities. So that's something that I want people to keep in mind. just as a little bit of personal background about who I am and where I'm coming from in regards to this issue. So I, as an undergrad, didn't study Asian studies, didn't study China, didn't study Tibetan studies. I came to this topic through practical experience. I went to China first as a backpacker after graduating from university as an anthropologist, and then ended up working there as a teacher and a development worker, working with Tibetan communities, more or less by accident, stayed there for 8 years, got involved with a bunch of projects in different communities, and through that practical, lived, on-the-ground experience, needed to deepen my understanding of the situation there, which is how I came into my knowledge of the region, its languages, and so on. I left in about 2013. I left from China, and since then I've been working more or less full-time on research, looking at issues of language, politics in relation to Tibet, and particularly these minoritized communities amongst Tibetans and the political predicaments that they're in. And so I'll be mentioning some of that as well. And in terms of like why I do this and what my aims are, like no research is without agendas and so on. So I just put this quote from Patrick Wolf here down the bottom that gives a sense of why I do what I do, what my agenda is, if you like. So in order for something to be resisted, it must first be understood, right? And so I see the projects that I'm working on in terms of language, urbanization, and Tibetan politics more broadly as being politically engaged and politically applied research, which is that I'm hoping to understand systems of domination in order to lessen their impact and hopefully change them. So with that out of the way as sort of a preface to the talk, I'm just going to stick to the script that I've written and which has been circulated, so that that contains links to sources and so on if you want to use that as a guide throughout the talk. Okay. All right, so to begin with, what is settler colonialism?
Look,
so to begin,
crazy, by the way.
So to begin with, I want to look at settler colonialism as both a body of theory and a real-world practice of domination. What is settler colonialism? The defining feature of settler colonialism is that in this form of colonialism, the colonizer, the settler, comes to stay. In this way, says Patrick Wolf, invasion becomes a structure and not simply an event. In other forms of colonialism, the colonizer invades, perhaps leaves behind a small elite to rule or nominates a local elite to rule, but the colonizer eventually leaves. This might happen following an anti-colonial struggle, or it might have happened during the decolonization process during the mid-20th century, but the colonizer goes home, right? However, in the case of settler colonialism, the colonizer remains. They settle in the country and become a permanent presence there. And we see examples of contemporary settler colonialism in places like Australia, the USA, Canada, and New Zealand. And because of this emphasis on invasion as a structure, something stable and continuous, rather than an ephemeral event, this gives a very important temporal dimension to settler colonialism. Specifically, this is the idea that colonialism is now. Australia now is a settler colony. The USA now is a settler colony. Where did this theory come from? What is the history of settler colonialism? Not as a practice in the world, but as a theory or an intellectual tradition or field of study. Like many people, I first encountered the idea of settler colonialism through the work of Australian historian Patrick Wolf. He is one of the most eloquent, quotable, and well-known proponents of the settler colonial approach. However, a recent history of the field, the references there, shows how settler colonial studies was originally developed by Indigenous scholars and activists in Australia as a critique of post-colonial theory. This critique was developed in the early and mid-1990s when post-colonial theory was becoming highly influential here. Post-colonial theory, developed primarily from the experience of scholars from South Asia and the Middle East to explore the lasting impact of European colonialism, was seen as a poor model for explaining the predicament faced by Indigenous people in Australia. And so Aboriginal writers like Tony Birch and Gary Foley began questioning the relevance of post-colonial theory in Australia and developing new ways of thinking about the situation based on the reality of ongoing colonialism. And it was from these conversations and in this context that Patrick Wolfe began working out the ideas that became settler colonial studies. So the key to the development of settler colonial studies was the idea that colonialism needs to be considered in its specificities, that we cannot simply apply ideas and experiences from one colonial context to the next. Then, if we look at settler colonialism as a real-world practice, we've already seen how one of the defining features of settler colonialism is the fact that the settler doesn't go home. Despite a decolonization process, despite national independence, the settler remains. Theorists of settler colonialism have posited a number of other features that define this form of domination, and probably the most well-known feature of the logic of settler colonialism, again explicated in the work of Patrick Wolfe, is the elimination of the native. The idea that settler colonialism seeks to dissolve Indigenous society and erect a new settler society in its place. Beyond this, although there are several other key features of settler colonialism, what I want to focus on here very briefly is the role of population transfer in settler colonialism. The work Settler Colonialism, a Theoretical Overview by Lorenzo Vercini suggests that mass transfer of populations and a transferist rationale are inherent to the practices of settler colonialism. Vercini examines a number of strategies of population transfer, which you can see here. Some of them are concrete ways of moving physical bodies through space, but many of them are conceptual forms of transfer, of redefining and reclassifying particular populations and transferring them between categories rather than physical space. Vercini claims that, quote, all of these strategies aimed to manipulate the population economy by discursively or practically emptying the indigenous sector of the population system. And I'll come back to this idea of population transfer later in the talk, both in terms of its importance within settler colonialism as a mode of domination, but also its diversity and complexity, which we see here. All right, so we need to think about, in the Tibetan case, the diversity of what population transfer can mean. Which was the point that I was going to make. But okay, next I want to go on to look at the idea of settler colonialism in Tibet in terms of previous work. So to date, the settler colonial framework has rarely, and I would argue often somewhat superficially, been applied to the situation in Tibet. I want to begin this section of the talk by looking at two reasons why I think that this has happened. So one reason, and a very important reason, is the PRC's rejection of the idea that the relationship between Tibet and China can or should be described as colonial. And just as a side note, I take as a given that it is a colonial situation. We can talk about that later if you want, but to me, it's just a historical reality that the relationship between Tibet and China is colonial. So, all right. So indeed, the PRC rejects completely the idea that it has engaged in colonialism at all. It sees colonialism exclusively as a European phenomenon and portrays itself as a victim of such colonialism. Discussions of colonialism in relation to Tibetans and other colonized people in the PRC is thus suppressed, meaning that we lack the sort of grounded analysis, the standpoint view of colonialism from the perspective of the victim that gave rise to settler colonial studies. In addition to this suppression of the analysis of analysis and knowledge production, we also see academic efforts to reject descriptions of the Tibetan situation as colonial, most notably in the work of political scientist Barry Saltman. So here's some links to his work, and just as a side note, I would basically consider his work to be in the vein of classic denialism. And we can talk about that later if you want to know what I mean by that. So Saltman has published a number of articles aiming to debunk claims that Tibet is a Chinese colony. He focuses in particular on demographic issues, but also on issues of genocide, including cultural genocide. Saltman does not explicitly address the issue of settler colonialism, but in rejecting the colonial label in total, it's clear that he would also reject the label of settler colonialism. So, the Chinese state has refused the label colonial and suppressed knowledge production by Tibetans in Tibet that would help advance a colonial analysis of the situation. Meanwhile, academics such as Saltman have legitimized this claim. This statist and scholarly denial must, I think, be considered the primary reason why a settler colonial framing has not been applied to the Tibetan predicament, especially by Tibetan scholars themselves. So, in addition, and very much as a second order phenomenon, another limitation on the application of settler colonial theories to the study of Tibet has been political stances advocated by Tibetans themselves. This perspective has been explored by Emily Ye and Dawa Lokitsang, looking at the issues both within China and in exile. Emily Ye has described how Tibetans in both exile and within China have rejected framing the Tibet issue in terms of colonialism and indigeneity, primarily for strategic political purposes. And Dawa Lokitsang has also looked at how in India, Tibetan views of indigenous peoples and tribal peoples and the often negative views that are portrayed by the Indian state have also created barriers to Tibetans claiming and expressing an indigenous identity. So these are some of the barriers. The primary ones are from the Chinese state, but then there are also issues in the Tibetan community itself. So nonetheless, despite these obstructions to developing a settler colonial approach to the Tibet issue, we have seen a recent turn to using the term settler colonial in relation to Tibet, particularly from scholars coming out of the University of Colorado's Tibet Himalaya initiative. Dawa Lokitsang, for example, has described the Chinese project in Tibet as settler colonial in her presentations, blog posts, and publications, and this is a recent publication where she refers to the Tibetan predicament as settler colonial. And in at least one conference presentation, the abstract of which has been published online, Natalie Avalos has discussed the Tibetan issue through a settler colonial lens. And finally, Carol McGranahan in 2019 has also applied a settler colonial lens to Tibet in her essay, Chinese Settler Colonialism, Empire and Life in the Tibetan Borderlands. In addition to these scholarly uses of settler colonialism to label and understand Tibet, we have also seen the increasing use of the term in social media, particularly Twitter, to talk about Tibet. Now, in my own work, I've been trying to think through the Tibetan predicament, particularly in relation to the oppression of languages, through a colonial lens. And I've taken inspiration in my work from settler colonial studies in a number of ways. So I've argued that we need to think about Tibet as being in a situation of contemporary, ongoing colonial domination, that we need to think about how the Tibetan situation now is colonial in the same way that settler colonial theories encourage us to think about the USA or Australia as contemporary forms of colonialism, animated by logics that were established at invasion. I've also drawn inspiration from settler colonial studies' insistence that we think through colonialisms in their specificity, rather than thinking via analogy or simply transferring descriptions of colonial logics from one context to another. However, I've so far stopped short of referring to Tibet as a settler colonial situation. And some of my reluctance is explained in this quote, and I'm also going to talk about that further today. What I want to raise the question is, maybe this reluctance is unfounded. Maybe we should actually be thinking about Tibet simply straightforwardly as a settler colonial situation. So basically, whilst I think there are sites and moments in Tibet that can be thought of as settler colonial. I think the overall picture is more complex. I think the situation is definitely colonial, but that this encompasses something more than just settler colonialism. But I'm also not convinced that I'm right about this, which is something I want to come back to at the end of my talk. Okay, so now I want to look at urbanization and settler colonialism, both in Tibet and elsewhere in the world. In this section, I want to look at the relationship between urbanization and settler colonialism, and between urbanization and colonialism in Tibet. To start with, I'll talk about settler colonialism and urbanization generally, based on an article that I recently published, co-authored with Juhan Wang. In this article, we used literature on urbanization and indigenous people in settler colonial societies such as Australia and the USA to examine how urbanization is used as part of the apparatus of settler colonial domination. And so here I'm just going to briefly summarize some of the findings from that literature. So basically, the picture that emerges from this literature, and the way that I would put it, the way I think about it, is that settler colonial cities are engines of invasion and domination. As a metaphor for thinking about settler colonial cities, we can consider them to be like the traction cities that you can see in this picture from the film and novel Mortal Engines. So these traction cities, giant mobile towns that roam a post-apocalyptic landscape, are simultaneously places of habitation and engines of conquest and violence. And so are settler colonial cities, I would argue. And although settler colonial cities are immobile, unlike these traction cities, they are part of a mobile practice of domination that has, for half a millennium, roamed across the earth, sucking up resources and destroying communities, leaving a path of destruction in its wake. So here's what the literature has to say about settler colonialism and urbanization. And I should just point out that all of this literature I'm citing is from an indigenous standpoint. So it gives us an insight into the indigenous experience of urbanization, right? The impact of settler colonial urbanization on indigenous people. So first of all, this literature tells us that settler colonial cities are engines of dispossession. They are ways of claiming territory from indigenous people and nullifying their sovereignty. So for example, here in Melbourne, the city is built on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people. But settler colonial cities do not only exert control over the territories that they're built on. They also extend control over much larger territories by connecting to other cities through infrastructural networks, and also to key nodes in resource extraction and circulation networks. So we can think about urban centers as a linchpin in a system of broader territorial control in settler colonial contexts. Settler colonial cities are also engines of demographic engineering that serve to manipulate the population economy. They are essentially portals for population swamping. So for example, here in Melbourne, the estimated 700 local indigenous inhabitants in 1836 were confronted with a settler population that grew from an initial handful to 5,500 5 years later. There were 25,000 settlers by 1851, and then 125,000 by 1861, and we now have a total population of 5 million here in Melbourne. Meanwhile, the growth of the city was accompanied by the violent destruction of the local indigenous population, which was reduced by around 90% during the initial period of occupation. Cities are also sites where indigenous people are assimilated. One example of how this is achieved is the practice of pepper potting, which means deliberately dispersing indigenous people throughout the settler population of a city as a way to break down or inhibit the formation of communities and to prevent the maintenance of indigenous language, culture, and identity in the city. At the same time, cities are also places where indigenous people are subject to increased scrutiny and surveillance by both the mainstream settler population in general and by official representatives of the state, such as the police. So on the one hand, the city renders indigenous people hyper-visible. However, on the other hand, cities are also sites where indigenous people are rendered invisible through practices of erasure. In urban environments, erasure sometimes means efforts to exclude indigenous people from the city or to confine them within certain parts of the city. Erasure can also be achieved symbolically by removing signs of indigeneity and replacing them with tokens of settler identity, creating a semiotic environment that conceals indigenous presence and sovereignty, so that, as Eileen Morton Robinson puts it, and this is a quote, "These cities signify with every building and every street that this land is now possessed by others. Signs of white possession are embedded everywhere in the landscape." So this literature on settler colonialism and urbanization provides us with a number of themes: cities as engines of dispossession, cities as engines of territorial control, cities as demographic portals, and cities as sites of assimilation, surveillance, and erasure. So next, I'd like to move on to look at some of the materials from a second article that Eli mentioned. This one focuses specifically on Tibet, and again employs the literature on settler colonialism, but also draws on a broader literature on colonialism, mostly from anti- and decolonial perspectives, such as the writing of Frantz Fanon and Achille Mbembe. In this article, we argue that rather than aiming at elimination, urbanization in Tibet seeks to achieve differential inclusion, which is a form of forcible incorporation, resulting in particular spaces and populations being, quote, deemed integral to the nation only or precisely because of their designated subordinate standing. Our article explores the production of differential inclusion of Tibet through three mechanisms: segregation, negation, and congregation. Okay. So let's start with segregation. So I want to start by clarifying what I don't mean by segregation. Firstly, I'm not referring to a legal regime that separates persons from one another in shared space, such as apartheid or the Jim Crow laws in the US South. Nor am I referring to the forms of segregation within the city, such as redlining, white flight, gentrification, the formation of ethnic enclaves and ghettos, and so on. Instead, what I'm referring to is the role that urbanization plays in segregating territories into Han and Tibetan spaces, and in distributing essential services and infrastructures that impact on quality and quantity of life between those territories via urbanization. So basically, what I think we see is that essential services that provide quality of life and help defer death are concentrated in Han urban centers, meaning that the pursuit of the good life for Tibetans often means moving outside of Tibet. In Han urban centers, Tibetans must use the national language, Putonghua. They are also subjected to regimes of discrimination. In these cities, Tibetans are also subjected to increased surveillance, and the social and physical infrastructures required to reproduce their languages, cultures, and identities are either prohibited or suppressed. The sequestering of essential services inside Han urban spaces thus acts as a form of coerced inclusion that exposes Tibetans to assimilatory pressures. Two areas where this dynamic operates are healthcare and education. Regarding healthcare, in the area where the majority of Tibetans live, which is outside the Tibet Autonomous Region, the best medical facilities are always located in provincial capitals, so Kunming, Xining, Chengdu, and so on. Serious health problems therefore require medical migration to Han urban cities. Regarding education, we see something similar, particularly for universities, that for Tibetans outside the Tibet Autonomous, to go to university means to leave the Tibetan homelands, to travel to Han-dominated spaces. In the Australian context, but in a situation that neatly measures this sort of sequestering of essential services out, in the Australian context, but in a situation that neatly reflects the sort of segregation that I'm describing here, the human rights scholar Damien Short has described the sequestering of essential services outside of Aboriginal homelands as a form of cultural genocide through urbanization. So that's what I mean when I talk about segregation. Next, I want to talk briefly about negation. By negation, I'm referring to the negation of legal structures of the so-called ethnic autonomy through processes of urbanization. To understand this, it's important to realize that urbanization is not simply a process of material and demographic concentration and construction, i.e., it does not refer simply to the building of cities. In the People's Republic of China, urbanization is also an administrative and legal process that changes the legal status of territories. In particular, this process, known as administrative urbanization, has profound impacts on laws pertaining to ethnic autonomy. Basically, it appears that urbanization erodes ethnic autonomy that is granted to territories and enables certain preferential policies to be applied. This turns previously ethnically autonomous territories into regular state territories and removes the admittedly weak and insufficient legal protections for minorities in China. Such administrative urbanization is widespread in Tibetan areas. So, for example, in Yunnan, Sichuan, and Gansu, the seat of every single Tibetan autonomous prefecture is designated as a county-level city, meaning that the capital of all of these Tibetan autonomous prefectures is not itself ethnically autonomous. More broadly, we find that just over half, 53.5% of all Tibetan territory in the PRC, including 75% of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, is now administered by urban units of territorial government, meaning that essentially over half of Tibetan territory is no longer. Okay, so finally, let's look at the issue of congregation. By congregation, I'm referring to the concentration of diverse populations in urban settlements within the Tibetan homelands. Specifically, I'm referring to urbanization within large and medium-sized towns with populations of thousands or tens of thousands, such as prefecture and county capitals. In most of these towns, Tibetans are demographically dominant. Whereas segregation aims to drive assimilation to Han norms, and negation aims to undermine legal autonomy, congregation in these urban centers works on a very different dynamic. And I think that this dynamic is best characterized by the existence of lateral violence amongst Tibetans. This is not to say that sinicization doesn't take place in these towns or that it isn't a concern to their inhabitants, but different dynamics are at play, such that in Shangri-La, in Yunnan, local Tibetans are able to exercise consistently prejudiced stances towards local Yi people. And throughout the towns of Amdo, Tibetans have been able to mobilize against immigrant populations of Chinese Muslims, engaging in protest, boycotts, and even communal violence. So sinicization and assimilation are only part of the more complex dynamic in these towns, which are characterized by Tibetan demographic and social dominance. This often means that local Tibetans in the town are able to exercise dominance over other Tibetan immigrants. In my own work, I've looked at processes at this level in relation to languages. So in my research, I've tried to document how Tibetans are a linguistically diverse population speaking dozens of different languages. Many of these languages are spoken by people who are linguistic minorities amongst Tibetans. When these Tibetans move to prefecture and county urban centers, they often move from a rural context where everyone speaks their language to a town where they are in the minority. So for example, when speakers of Manigacha and Ngandoha languages in Amdo move to the town of Rongwo, they are dominated by local Tibetan speakers. And when Tibetans that speak Damdo Munya in a language in Eastern Kham move to the city of Kanding, they are surrounded by Tibetan speakers. Or when speakers of Lamo in the Tibetan Autonomous Region are relocated to the city of Chamdo, they are surrounded by Tibetan speakers. For these linguistic minorities among Tibetans, making a life in a Tibetan urban environment often means assimilating to Tibetan norms rather than Han Chinese ones, Tibetanization rather than sinicization. Language represents a general dynamic that plays out in relation to other factors of intra-Tibetan diversity, including regional and local identities, sectarian affiliation, and so on. So in summary then, what I've tried to outline here is how I think urbanization in Tibet achieves differential inclusion through these processes of segregation, negation, and congregation. In some ways, these processes mirror what we see in settler-colonial urbanization through the processes of dispossession, territorial control, population swamping, and so on. For example, negation through administrative urbanization nullifies the remnants of sovereignty that Tibetans exercised in their territories. The urban expansion that we see in congregation requires the dispossession of former rural communities. And segregation drives assimilation and subjects Tibetans to surveillance. So there's an overlap between those two sets of processes that I described. However, there appears to be one crucial difference between urbanization in Tibet and settler-colonial urbanization. As we suggest in our article, by using the term differential inclusion, urbanization in Tibet, rather than aiming for the elimination of the native, seems to be geared towards the subordination of Tibetans, to contain them, keep them in place, homogenize them, and perhaps assimilate an educated urban elite. Conspicuously absent from this dynamic, however, is the demographic function of urbanization in settler colonialism, the use of cities as portals for mass transfer of settlers. Given this, it seems that we should conclude that although urbanization in Tibet is definitely colonial, it is perhaps not settler colonial. Okay. So just moving towards the end now, hopefully give us some time for discussion. Okay. In coming towards the conclusion of this talk, I want to discuss some of the future directions for research that I think might complicate and even challenge the conclusion that I've just given, right? That it's maybe not settler colonial. I think there are two important topics that bear further scrutiny regarding urbanization as a technique of colonial governance in Tibet and the relevance of settler colonialism for understanding Tibet. So, the first regards questions about the spatial distribution of different modes of colonialism across Tibet. As I concluded above, one of the key factors that distinguishes urban congregation in Tibet from classical settler colonial urbanization elsewhere is the demographic factor. In many prefectures and county towns across Tibet, Tibetans appear to be currently the demographically dominant group. Whereas in settler colonial urbanization, we've consistently seen rapid and massive demographic minoritization of indigenous peoples. So think about those statistics that I gave for Melbourne, think about New York or any city in the US and the scale and scope of demographic minoritization there. However, I do think that something like these processes of classical settler colonial urbanization does occur in some places in Tibet, most notably in Amdo, in places such as Haixi, Haibei, and Haidong in the northern and western parts of Qinghai province. I think one task for future research is to look carefully at these cities and their material and demographic histories. This should be done within the context of the broader colonial strategy in Tibet. What has made these sites so amenable to settler colonialism, in contrast to other places in Tibet? Is it their proximity to important resource frontiers? Is it something about the prior population structures or their political organization? Is it something about physical environments and their relative habitability for Han settlers? Or is it a question of infrastructure, since these regions lie along the road and railway routes from Xining to Lhasa? Do these settler colonial cities in northern Amdo represent an historical anomaly, or do they foretell something of the future for the rest of Tibet? What is daily life like for Tibetans and others in these towns? Should we think of these sites as being characterized more by dynamics of congregation or segregation or something else? And apart from northern and western Amdo, where else are these key sites of unambiguous classical settler colonial urbanization in Tibet, and how would we know? Secondly, I think much greater attention should be given to prefecture and county towns that are sites of demographic dominance by Tibetans. So far, research on Tibetan urbanization has tended to focus on the experience of segregation, looking at Tibetans in places such as Xining and Chengdu. And this is mostly for practical reasons, because these sites are accessible to international researchers, right? We can go there. We can't often go to other places. I'd also note that there is research in the city of Shangri-La in Yunnan and the newly designated city of Rongwo, and these are important exceptions to that general pattern. I think that one aspect that bears a closer scrutiny in these sites of congregation is the relationship between Tibetans and other groups, such as between Tibetans and Yin Nashi in Shangri-La, or between Tibetans and Monpa and Lopa people in the southern prefecture towns of the Tibet Autonomous Region, or between Tibetans and Chang people in western Sichuan. A second aspect that also needs further investigation is the social, political, and cultural relationships that develop between different types of Tibetans in prefecture and county towns. These relations between Tibetans and others and amongst Tibetans, thirdly, need to be considered in relation to the particular characteristics of the built environment in these towns, which often take the form of what I have called Tibetan-esque architecture, which is designed to evoke traditional Tibetan forms and give a superficially ethnic character to these towns. So rather than the material erasure of Tibetan presence, what we see is the amplification and the superficial concretization of Tibetanness in the built environment. I think a productive way of looking at all of these issues in Tibetan urban centers in terms of Verentini's typology of population transfers, which I have mentioned towards the beginning of the talk. So we had all those different types of population transfer, right? Necropolitical transfer, ethnic transfer, and so on. So I think that the concentration of Tibetans from diverse backgrounds, speaking different languages, with attachments to different homelands, coming from different kin networks and even kinship systems, practicing different religious forms and so on. And sometimes as well, their symbolic and demographic dominance over other groups presents challenging questions about what it means to eliminate the native. What I'm interested in asking is, can we think of processes of assimilation and lateral violence that take place in these congregated urban centers as being part of the process of eliminating the native? Essentially, can you have a city that is still Tibetan, but the native has been eliminated from it? Basically, what I'm asking is, can we stretch the concept of the elimination to include processes that still leave Tibetans and Tibetanness in place, but instead of the diversity, the multiplicity of Tibetanness and Tibetan identities, what we would see in these urban centers is instead a hollowed out and flattened version of Tibetanness that is achieved through various sorts of physical and conceptual population transfers. In asking these questions about spatial distinction between forms of colonialism and the social, cultural, and political processes taking place in prefectures and county towns, I think that we need to adhere to the analytical spirit of settler colonialism. I think we need to continue adhering to the spirit of settler colonialism by looking at the colonialism as contemporary, but also trying to figure out the specificities of colonial domination in the Tibetan context, right? Rather than simply applying models from Australia, the US, and so on onto the Tibetan context. And I might leave it there and go to questions. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and thanks for your patience for the technological issues. I've really enjoyed the talk this morning. If anyone has any questions, feel free to chase me up anywhere on the internet, and I'll be happy to talk further.